The ClimateTech innovation I'm most excited about is plant-based mac and cheese packaging that I can also eat without hot sauce.
I've got a craving for mac and cheese just based on this conversation. I don't know if you can get that in Kentaro.
Let us know how that goes, yeah. This is ClimateTech with Kentaro, a podcast featuring the brightest minds and most influential voices in climate tech. I'm your host, Kentaro Kawamori. Over the past few months alone, I've had the really unique and fairly enviable position of being exposed to some of the most fascinating parts of climate and climate tech work globally. And in sharing those conversations and solutions to a whole host of stakeholders, policymakers, standard setters, and all those in between, I've had the pleasure of working directly with our guest today, Dan Kosmic and Torsten Lichtenau. Dan, based in London, is a partner at Bain Co and is responsible for the firm's sustainability technology partnerships globally. He's been with the firm for over 25 years, which is half of the firm's total history. Meanwhile, Torsten, also based in London, is a senior partner and leads the topic of decarbonization globally for the entire firm. He supports clients across industries and geographies and is very focused on helping them decarbonize their businesses. In this episode, I talked to Dan and Torsten about their tenure at Bain and the strategic changes within the firm, particularly towards deploying capital for climate solutions. We also talk about what exciting products and services in climate tech they're tracking.
So I'm a Bainie through and through. I started many years ago now, 17, 18 years ago after PhD.
That's Torsten.
And what I wanted to do is just help company transform, be better, more enjoyable for the employees, better for the customers. And what I liked about consulting is that you can do that in many sectors. You can tackle many different topics. It's a people business. And over the years, as you can imagine, climate became a bigger part of this journey. And something like 2 years ago, I decided that I want to spend 100% of my time just helping clients decarbonize, find value in the process, lead the industry, transform the way things happening. And it's been the most amazing journey. And just being able to make a small contribution to that within the firm with our clients is what drives me every day.
Yeah, where Torsten was a bit more deliberate, mine was a bit more serendipitous.
That's Dan.
As Torsten said, if you're with people that you really love and you're and impressed by them daily, and then you find ways to learn and develop and take on new challenges, it's really hard to kind of feel like, I need to go do something else. I need to find something else. It's usually when that learning starts to asymptote that you're like, maybe there must be something else out there. And so I actually spent the last 4 years of my career running our Nordics business. And in the last year of my time in the Nordics, we acquired a consulting firm in Denmark, based in Denmark, but it was Nordic-wide, and we integrated it. And so I basically put myself out of a job because the founder of that consulting firm became our new head of the Nordic business. We don't have a long history of acquisitions, and so I wanted to use that skill of being able to develop external relationships, being able to marshal acquisitions through Bain Company, knowing how to integrate and get the most out of a partnership. And so I said to our firm leadership, where can I help, given that's a bit of a unique skill within our partnership? And they said, we need to build an ecosystem of the best people in the world with the most compelling capabilities that are solving this problem, this challenge of climate transition. And we're not going to be able to do that alone. And we don't want to just, pick who's available at the time to partner with. We want to be deliberate. So would you take on that as a part of your mission to work globally on our acquisitions, our investments, our partnerships in the area of sustainability, but specifically in climate, because it's the area that we're focused on? And that's when Torsten and I had known, and Torsten had done a lot of work in the Nordics. We'd known each other, but that's when we explicitly joined up.
Dan, you talked a little bit about traditionally from a corporate development perspective, limited experience in acquisitions and investments. You gave us a little bit of a preview of the impetus for that strategic change. What did you learn from the journey of being, strategic consulting firm at the core of your business, moving more into, deploying capital into the right, ways to create additional value ostensibly for the firm and your clients? How did that evolve? How do you look at when and where it makes sense to make investments?
I would say over the last couple of decades, we've realized that the challenges of the day have become so technically complex that it really is difficult to argue that under one roof you can build all the right capabilities. And if we define our success, which we always have, and this is from the very beginning, and it's also a part that I love, and I know Torsten does too about Bain, is our success can only be defined by the results that you achieve at a client. It doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how many books you wrote, it doesn't matter what kind of theories that you've espoused along the way. If nothing happens and nothing changes for the better, and it isn't significant, it really doesn't matter that much. And if you take that approach and then you take problems like climate, you start to realize there are a set of capabilities and a set of teams out there that do that in a way that we're not going to be able to replicate. So we have a choice. Either we try to play catch up in all the different areas and build it all ourselves and kind of have it all under one roof, or, and I think this is another trait of our firm, we take a more humble approach to say, aren't we the group that should consolidate to curate those for our clients and come to a client with a toolkit? And we play a role, but others play a role as well. And strategically, that combination of capabilities and people is incredibly compelling to create the results that client wants. And within that, the idea of becoming an investor has always been to lock in the strategic benefit. So, and that was, our discussions with you, is we see the benefit strategically of the partnership with Persefoni and Bain.
Yes, I would say when we believe that to bring the very best to clients, to deliver results, you need to bring the very best capabilities. You can't do that as a patchwork of capabilities, not a kind of a potpourri of different capabilities. You throw them together, you come on the client. I think it needs to be based on deep partnerships that are strategic, where the management team on both sides know each other and wants to achieve the same. And I think that's absolutely what's so critical for us. It's a curated set of partnership and capabilities, and we're together with our partners. We can just help clients achieve results they could never before.
So let's dig in a little bit more specifically on ClimateTech. As you guys have been surveying the space, you have some of the world's most preeminent research capabilities and analytical capabilities. Talk to us about the kind of the broader spectrum of categories which are exciting for you guys and your business, whether you're invested in it or not. But where do you see, the biggest opportunity for investors, customers, whether that's Bain as an investor or whether that's just a professional full-time investor? What are those subcategories of ClimateTech that are most exciting for you? And you can't say carbon accounting because that's a loaded answer. So aside from carbon accounting, what are you guys looking at? What's exciting for you at the moment?
I would say there are probably 3 or 4 very interesting areas where technology and data can play a big role. One is probably around climate risks. So the ability to assess both the transition and the physical risk from the transition. So physical risks, if the earth gets warmer, what is the risk for my assets? And transition risk is if basically we make this transition, could some of my assets get stranded? And I think the ability to apply the latest data analytics to it can make a huge difference and provide really differentiated answer for our clients. So that's probably one area that is very interesting. I think increasingly the other one is probably life cycle assessment, to really be able to assess at product level how much carbon actually is in that product end to end, and also when I use it. That's another area where we've seen probably technology play a key role. The third one is probably everything you can do with satellite imagery and the data coming from it and applying AI. And a good example for that is being able to assert the quality of offsets using that technology. That's a very, very fast moving space It can also be used, for example, to detect methane leaks, methane venting, flaring. That's where satellite imagery can play a key role. But again, you need to apply AI and machine learning to it to be able to pinpoint key actions to take. And maybe the last one that I would mention is probably the topic of circularity, where increasingly you can also apply technology to try to solve the issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. You started with climate risk. People talk about the data problem and ClimateTech broadly, right? I think nowhere is that more apparent than actually two of the spaces you just talked about, climate risk and the offset verification piece, which I'm hearing a lot of chatter about right now in the investor community as well. Mm-hmm. So let's maybe shift more into the firm's perspective and investments into its services. So, less about the partnerships that you're forging around ClimateTech, investments and companies, but talk to us about the evolution of the firm's capabilities around climate over the last few years. And also would love to hear about your specific experience in natural resources and energy, because I think that's really topical to that journey.
Yeah, if you think about the capabilities, where we start is probably putting ourselves in the CEO's shoes and saying, if I'm a CEO, I'm looking at climate, what do I need to tackle? And there are probably 4 or 5 topics where they need probably take actions, make decisions, and therefore potentially need help from us. One, I think, is really around net zero strategy or climate strategy. What are the scenarios in front of me? What are the signposts telling me I should go left or right? How do I really embed climate to my strategy? And how do I keep that strategy alive throughout the year? It's not a once-a-year exercise, but more a living strategy throughout. So that's one area where we believe we have developed actually a very differentiated offering, because that's critical. The second one is you can have the best strategy in the world, but if your investors don't buy into it, you will struggle to implement it. And I think that investors are getting more and more assertive, but also more and more discerning about what they expect from company. And in the years to come, it won't be enough just to have a bold ambition. You need to show that you deliver, but also be very crisp on how you explain your strategy. And that's probably another area, the shareholder dialogue or the net zero capital markets dialogue, which I think is critical. The third one is around value creation. And clearly you need to decarbonize your operation, your supply chain with your customers. And that's super important. And that's part of the toolkit. But if you can't monetize it, you won't create value. And I think being able actually to explain to your customer why you're better, why your value proposition is lower carbon, why you innovate better, how you can combine potentially products with offsets, that's the other bit of it. So the value creation for us is delivery and monetization at the same time. So that's probably a third big area. Increasingly, I think companies are realizing often you can't go on your own. You will need to form alliances, cooperation, partnerships. So I think a fourth area is really around results-driven ecosystem or partnership that you can build as a company. You need to decide where you compete and where you partner, but when you partner, really make sure you get the results. You don't end up in a talking shop where you just meet with a lot of your peers but don't achieve a lot. So that's another area where CEO tends to need help. And the very last one is very much around what we call the operating model. So how do I organize myself around it? How do I motivate my people? How do I upskill them? How align my structure to my strategy? How do I manage carbon like I manage cost? And so really making sure that you green your operating model is a fifth area. And over the past couple of years, I think we've made quite a few inroads on these 5 areas to make sure that we can be very helpful, but also very pragmatic with the CEOs. So that's to give you a bit of a sense of what are the toolkits, products, areas we think about, but it always starts with the CEO and how we help a CEO achieve what they want to achieve in carbon.
It does. And you mentioned the CEO there a few times. Give us your perspective on how their perspective has changed over the last 12, 24 months, from this thing that's coming up to I've got to set a net zero target to compliance on the horizon. What are you hearing from the CEO community?
So think about 2021. It was probably a big year of ambition. You had COP26, a big event, 6 years after Paris, all the nations being asked to update their plans and all the corporates also trying to raise their ambition. And you could just see how many embrace a science-based target just before the event and putting just a big stake in the ground. And that was super important. But it's very clear that straight after COP26, already in December, January, the dialogue is starting to shift. The dialogue is shifting to delivery. Now I've made a big commitment. How can I deliver it? And then basically value creation. If I'm delivering, can I do that in a cost-effective way? Can I do that in a way that is compelling to my customers, my investors? And I think so the big dialogue that we're having with CEO is very much around how do you deliver and how you monetize all the efforts you've put into climate. And we don't think it's morally wrong to want to make money out of it, because you can only reinvest in a topic and accelerate if you're able to have a business model that works. And so for companies wanting really to actually create value out of the climate transition, it's absolutely right. That's the only way to get there.
And Dan, Bain has such a dominant position in private equity as its client base. The corollary to the CEO and the private equity world are the general partners or the GPs.
Yeah.
What about on that end? How have you seen that conversation and those priorities shift?
I mean, it's pervasive at the moment. I mean, there isn't really a fund that we work with, and that now includes the sovereign wealth funds that, maybe historically you wouldn't have normally pointed to as big champions of topics like around sustainability. But I'm here in the Middle East working on exactly that topic. The challenge that they have. So it is something that all GPs, all investors, institutional investors are thinking about. They realize that it will impact their returns. There isn't yet enough empirical evidence to really make the connection that a sustainable investor, a successful sustainable investor, is going to see higher returns systemically. There's an assumption, there's a hypothesis, but if you look at all the empirical studies that have been done, maybe 2/3 of them say that the relation is positive, but the other third may say it's either neutral or maybe even negative. But all of it is circumstantial at this point. And so they're all saying it's important. We need to integrate this into how we make investment decisions. They will probably bias more today towards risk and just compliance. The compliance piece, they know in order to be an investor in this particular market, we're going to have to disclose. So that piece of it is fairly evident and not a lot of questions. But how much risk is there? How much would I discount an IRR of an investment based on the carbon emissions profile of that and the likely abatement requirements is still a lot of art in addition to science. And then lastly, if you don't really bring along your investment professionals to understand that, because the empirical evidence isn't yet there, you can say a lot of things at the top of the house and you can say a lot of things in the market. But when you get in the room of the investment committee, people realize it's hard to actually make decisions based on all that, even though we know it should have an impact. And so people can become a little bit cynical and say, this is a bit of a check the box exercise, but at the end of the day, the classic way we think about returns wins the day in terms of where we invest. So really, really turning that. But you saw it last year as of COP26, it's even more so. It's now, you just really, I can't think of a client that we're not having this discussion with.
The professional investment world is going through so much change at the moment. In the 2022 version of his annual letter to CEOs, BlackRock's own CEO, Larry Fink, defended their investment firm's focus on environmental, social, and governance concerns, and said that stakeholder capitalism is not, quote-unquote, woke. Meanwhile, in February this year, global private equity giant Carlyle announced its own commitments to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions across a large part of its portfolio by 2050 or sooner.
And it's interesting how you kind of bust through that challenge of not having the evidence. It can be done by just having an incredibly committed and compelling leader. So you can have, in Temasek, they had just leadership that said, this is what we're going to do, and we believe it, even though we know that the evidence is going to catch up to us to that belief, but we're going to start changing behaviors now. And we're going to use mechanisms that are imperfect, but they will start to approximate things like cost of carbon emissions. And we will start to think about how that might depress an IRR and use that in every one of our investment decisions. Even though we know it's not perfect, it's not yet as precise as we need it. But if we don't start that now, then the behavior change and the way that people think will just lag, and it will stay lagging. But I think a lot of people, the delta between what you see on the website and what you see in the public statements, and then what you see in that closed door room of the investment committee and how it really is working, for many of them is pretty wide. And I think if you did a poll, which would be interesting to do, of all the sustainability leaders in these investment funds, you would see that there's a fair amount of frustration. Like, how do we actually live the mission, live the commitment that we've said explicitly every day, which is a lot harder to do than it is to write a policy statement.
Agreed. Or the flip side of somebody that just got pushed into that role and is just desperately and furiously trying to learn to keep up and figure out what to go do. So there's sort of two sides of that coin.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you mentioned Temasek as well, right? I've been having a lot of discussions with sovereign wealth funds and pension funds recently who, have a really unique ability to have an impact, unlike your average investor, I think, because they have oftentimes multi-generational long-term investment mandates and outlooks that, your average private equity or venture capital investor can't because of the fund structure. The corollary I always give to people is Bally Giffords, one of the very first investors into Tesla at the very beginning of its IPO journey, and many, many, many years later, with $1 trillion in market cap in sight, still hasn't sold. Probably isn't thinking about selling because they're looking at this from a different, multi-decade sort of perspective. And I think those sort of long-weighted investors with a huge amount of influence and long-weighted capital are going to be playing a really pivotal role in this when the story is all said and done.
I think that by definition, and I think a lot of sovereign wealth funds and institutional investors have started to weave this language or this logic into, which is, by definition, the mission that we have, the fiduciary responsibility, and the timing, the long-term nature of it, means that we have to be sustainable. We simply cannot invest in things that will increase in risk to the point where, in 5 years, in 10 years, there will be major issues with that investment. And so therefore, sustainability is really core to our mission. And that's another challenge that you have, is just the vernacular that you use. Because if you say sustainability, or if you disaggregate to ESG, a lot of people are going to think a lot of different things. But I think the real thoughtful leaders at the institution level are saying that that is just a way of describing our mission. And the kind of nuance of what does sustainability mean is now where we're becoming more precise and we're getting more sophisticated in our investment decisions.
That's right. Value creation and what does that mean, right? I think it's quite obvious for the investment community. Invest into great companies, watch that value rise. But Torsten, you alluded to this on the CEO agenda, value creation in the corporate space, way different, right? You're dealing with different stakeholders and constituencies. And, for me, value creation in the green and climate product space is pretty straightforward, right? I think unequivocally, because businesses are still for-profit entities, the vast majority will not spend a significantly higher amount of capital for a like product just because it's green. But the moment that the unit economics push the price of a product or service to be comparable and oftentimes lower these days, that becomes a no-brainer decision. Do you think that's something that CEOs truly understand, right? I think we talk about value creation and we ask them about, what does this mean for you? From what I'm seeing is, I think most of them probably even have a hard time imagining what that can look like, right? And in some cases, it's very obvious. In other cases, it's not. And as a great example of where it's very obvious, a friend of mine works locally here in Phoenix. She's an executive at a company called Footprint, which makes plant-based packaging alternatives. Work with huge CPG companies, Kraft and all those sorts of things. So instead of buying your Kraft mac and cheese in a plastic bowl, you can now buy it in a plant-based packaging material, right?
Can you eat it?
Technically, I think you could eat it. I don't know that you would want to eat it.
Would you want to eat it?
It is plant-based, so
just chomp on the bowl at the end. It's like
I'll
a
have
big
to ask
tortilla
that
chip
next time. Yeah. Hey, when can you make a delicious
that
edible?
Could be fast food. You eat the food and the packaging at the same time.
There you go. I like it.
I learned long ago with enough hot sauce, you can make almost anything.
You can
edible.
eat a lot with hot sauce. That's right.
Exactly. So yeah, that's a really obvious example, right? But maybe give us some examples of what's not so obvious. I'm sure you probably worked on some recent examples. Of course, don't divulge any client names that you can't, but what are those instances of value creation that may not be so obvious or that maybe just be interesting to learn about?
What's usually really hard is if you have a core business that has been hugely successful and is still successful, but very carbon intensive, and you are trying to build a new greener business on the side, if you want, or in parallel to it, what we'll call the engine 2 of growth. And finding the balance between the two is difficult. If you think about energy is a very good example. We know that the energy system won't change tomorrow. You can't stop tomorrow to produce any oil, any gas, and we'll have still energy in the world. It just doesn't work. And yet we all know that we need to make the shift. Now, how aggressively do you push for this new engine of growth, and how quickly do you transition the engine 1 that needs still to produce some cash flow to basically create the financing of the new entity is very difficult. And it's made even more difficult because when you think about attracting talent, potentially you are looking for different profiles in these two businesses. And if both are under one roof, how do you make sure that you attract actually the right individuals in each of the businesses? That's usually where we've seen the biggest challenging. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And I think it's made even more difficult by the fact that the transition might not be that orderly. It could be at times very disorderly. And so it's not that you can just plan the next 30 years and decide when you will make the big shift. You will need to be very adaptable and really look at the signposts in the market that are telling you how fast things are changing. So that's probably a perfect example of what can be challenging for CEO in a day-to-day life.
Excellent. Well, final topic and question for you guys. You know, when you think about climate tech broadly, we talked about some of the spaces that you're tracking that are emerging. For you personally, whether it's just as a consumer or whether it's in your day job as a Bainey, what is the most exciting product or service that you're tracking from a climate tech perspective that you're looking forward to consume or just following and are interested in?
If I were to name one at the moment, but I must say that my opinion changed over time, I like actually innovation that creates new market. And I think there's an element of how asserting the quality of offset could unlock a multi-billion market in the world. Currently, it's an area where many people want to invest, buy more offset, do the right things, but they just don't know what they're buying. They don't know if it's really making a difference, the quality is good. If we were able to use satellite imagery, LiDAR data, AI, all combined to actually have a much more transparent market and marketplace around that topic, I think would be quite game-changing. And I think would be game-changing for people on the ground who are growing or preserving forests, that they get the right reward for their work. And actually for corporates to be able to invest with confidence in that area. So that's probably one at the moment that is extremely exciting, especially given the interest in offsets. Dan?
Well, I don't know if it's specifically tech, but it would have some tech within it. It's more thematic. But for me, circularity, which used to be something, which then kind of wasn't something, is now kind of something again. And it's an area where we're spending a lot of time now developing approaches. We're getting, if I just use our pipeline as an indicator of where businesses are going to kind of have some real play with CEOs, that's almost exponentially growing the type of questions that so you get through this kind of how do we deal with the current state? And then you get to a bigger question, how do we never create that current state again? And it's a very compelling thought process to go into. And I think that theme will be the next thing that we talk about at a different level, at a different, that's beyond just kind of transition, but it's much more meaningful in terms of making circular business models.
And maybe one more, if I may, and I'm not saying that because we invest in Persefoni, but if carbon is that important, the ability to track and manage carbon like you manage cost, to really understand it on a monthly basis, the executive team to look at it, to forecast what will happen, to think about what are the levers that are more cost effective to reduce it. The ability to do that and make sure it's not a big compliance exercise where once a year you produce some Excel to put in your sustainable report, but truly a management tool, that actually excites me. And I think that could make such a difference. And we need to get to that place to manage carbon in a disciplined way. And when you hear about all the noise around compliance and maybe a SCC mandate coming, clearly in other countries like the UK, it already exists. We need this kind of tool to make a difference. And to have the CEO being able to go on a platform, click on a button and see what's happening with carbon is the place we need to be. And pretty much yesterday, not in 5 years' time.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, we're obviously biased, but it's sort of mind-boggling that we've had, $100 trillion of climate and ESG tax capital, and everybody talks about their carbon footprint or lowering it, and almost nobody knows what it is or how to track it. I mean, talk about a gap, right? Kind of crazy.
And if they do, there's 40 different approaches to doing it, so you can't.
Yeah, that's right. And crazy, low fidelity, all those sort of things. But we don't want to be shills. Your answers were way better than mine, because I would have told you the ClimateTech innovation I'm most excited about is plant-based mac and cheese packaging that I can also eat without hot sauce.
I've got a craving for mac and cheese just based on this conversation.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can get that in Qatar.
Let us know how that goes. Yeah. Well, thanks a bunch for joining, guys. It's been a pleasure, and let's do it again soon.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dan and Torsten as much as I did. If you're actually interested in working for Bain, Dan and Torsten told me that it's always recruiting season, so head on over to bain.com/careers. Before we go, please don't forget to subscribe to ClimateTech with Kentaro on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen. It would also be awesome if you could rate us and leave us a review. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you on our next episode. ClimateTech with Kentaro is produced by our incredible team at Persefoni and Hueman Group Media. Our theme music is by Guest House. If you want to learn more about Persefoni and our climate management and accounting platform, please visit our website at persefoni.com.